So this video we're going to talk about gas pickup and delivery for the respiratory system, and then we're going to talk about control of respiration, and then that should be it. So the first thing I want to talk about is the two gases that are being transported in the blood are oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they each get transported a little bit differently. The oxygen molecules, for example, we're going to start with oxygen molecules. And oxygen molecules are mostly going to be carried by hemoglobin. So there's only 1.5% of the oxygen molecules that are floating around in the plasma on their own. They typically get broken down very quickly, so not very many of them are going to be just floating around in the plasma. 98.5% of the oxygen molecules are going to be carried in the red blood cells attached to that hemoglobin molecule. Each red blood cell carries 280 million hemoglobin proteins inside them. So every red blood cell has 280 million hemoglobin proteins. And at the center of each protein, if you remember what the structure of a hemoglobin looks like, so this is a hemoglobin. There are 4 different globular proteins in one hemoglobin molecule, and at the center of the hemoglobin molecule is a structure called a heme group, and the heme group contains an iron, and that iron holds on to oxygen, so the iron binds to the oxygen. So really, every hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So when we look back here and we see that there's 280 million hemoglobin, and each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen, that means that each red blood cell can carry over 1 billion oxygen molecules. So that's just a lot of oxygen molecules compacted into that tiny little red blood cell. So when we talk about hemoglobin saturation, that means that if all the hemoglobin molecules in the blood were fully loaded with oxygen, so every single hemoglobin in the blood was completely saturated with an oxygen, holding on to an oxygen, that would mean that the blood was 100% saturated. It would be fully loaded. For another example then would be if only 75% of the hemoglobin molecules were bound to oxygen, then we would say the blood is only 75% saturated. And then if only half of the hemoglobin in the body contained oxygen, then we would say that that blood is 50% saturated. So we want to keep the body somewhere around 98.5% saturated. And anything below that is not bringing enough oxygen to the tissues of the body. So these hemoglobin molecules don't just hang on to these oxygen and then never let them go. So even if there was 100% saturation and the hemoglobin molecules contained, each of them contained the 4 oxygen molecules, when that red blood cell gets to an active tissue needs oxygen, it needs to be able to use that oxygen, then the hemoglobin will release the oxygen into the tissue. The lower the oxygen content that the tissue has, that means it's more active, then the more oxygen will be released by the hemoglobin molecules. So the more active a tissue, the more oxygen will be released. And how do we know if a tissue is active? Well, as the blood goes past that active tissue, the active tissue will have maybe a higher temperature. And then it knows that that is an active tissue and the hemoglobin will release the oxygen. Or the tissue will have less oxygen in it, in which case the hemoglobin will then release the oxygen. Or the tissue might have a lower pH, and then the hemoglobin will release the oxygen so that that tissue can then use the oxygen as a buffer. So basically, the active tissues will receive the oxygen as hemoglobin releases it, and the inactive tissues have very little demand for oxygen, so then more of the oxygen will stay bound to the hemoglobin. So now let's take a look at carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a gas that the tissues produce during metabolism. So as the tissues are breaking down glucose or breaking down lipids and trying to produce ATP that is energy for the cells, as the cells are doing this, they're producing carbon dioxide. And then we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide can't stay in the body. It's an acid, and we have to get rid of the acid. So the respiratory system can get rid of this carbon dioxide. First, we have to get the carbon dioxide back to the lungs from the tissue. So carbon dioxide will travel in the blood in 3 different ways, right? So 3 ways that it travels in the blood. The first is that it travels as bicarbonate. 70% of the carbon dioxide in the body will travel as bicarbonate. So what is bicarbonate? Bicarbonate is a weak base. And if we look at here, we can see, I'm going to show you this process here. So here we have carbon dioxide from the tissues. So these tissues have produced this carbon dioxide as sort of a byproduct of making ATP. And then that carbon dioxide leaves the tissues, goes into the blood, and then goes into a red blood cell. So this is our red blood cell. And then out here, this is our plasma. So the carbon dioxide goes into the red blood cell. Once in the red blood cell, it combines with water to become carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is H2CO3, and you'll be seeing that an awful lot. So this equation you kind of have to get used to. So the carbon dioxide and the water combine to form carbonic acid, and immediately carbonic acid will dissociate into hydrogen and bicarbonate. This is the bicarbonate that will be carried in that red blood cell until the red blood cell gets to where the lungs are, to where the alveoli are. Once that red blood cell, that capillary, carries that red blood cell to that alveoli area, then at that alveolus, the bicarbonate will combine with hydrogen again to become carbonic acid, which will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water, and then the carbon dioxide will diffuse across into the alveolus, and from there we can breathe that out through our lungs. So this is how the majority of carbon dioxide is carried. It's carried in the form of bicarbonate, and then bicarbonate can be transformed into carbon dioxide at the lungs where we can breathe it out. Then we have the next one, which is that carbon dioxide can be bound to hemoglobin. 23% of carbon dioxide will be bound to hemoglobin. So this is the same hemoglobin that oxygen binds to. So obviously oxygen and carbon dioxide can't be bound at the same time. So whenever oxygen levels are high, carbon dioxide levels are going to be low. Whenever carbon dioxide levels are high, then oxygen levels will be low. Lastly, we see that carbon dioxide can be carried as a dissolved gas in the plasma. So 7% of carbon dioxide will be carried in the plasma as a dissolved gas. So now I want to talk about local regulation of respiration, and I might have touched on this before in another video, but I just want to go over this again. So we can control our respiration either at the local level, and that occurs right at the lungs, or we can control it at a central level that occurs right in the brain. So first we're going to look at the local regulation. There are 2 different forms of local regulation. One is called perfusion, and the other one is called alveolar ventilation. So let's look at perfusion first. Perfusion is blood flow. So when we say that we're looking at the perfusion, we're talking about blood flow. How much blood flow is going to a certain area? Well, in the lungs, the respiratory capillaries, that blood flow will be directed towards the higher PO2. So it's going to be, the blood vessels are going to dilate whenever they are going to an alveolus that has a high oxygen content. So this is, we see the capillary dilation whenever we have high oxygen content in the alveolus. Now, other alveoli in the lungs, they might have low oxygen levels. In that case, the blood vessels, the capillaries going to those alveoli will become constricted. So the reason for this is that if we have a dilated blood vessel, then there's going to be more red blood cells. More red blood cells can be carried through that dilated capillary. And the more red blood cells we have, the more hemoglobin we have, and the more protein then we have to receive that oxygen. If an alveolus has low oxygen, there's no reason to have a lot of red blood cells because there's fewer red blood cells that would be in a constricted blood vessel, but there's not a lot of oxygen, so we don't need a lot of red blood cells for that oxygen to bind to. This is very different from what we see in the body usually. Usually when a blood vessel is going towards a tissue that has low oxygen, so if this is a tissue and it has low oxygen, that means that the tissue needs oxygen, so then the blood vessel would actually dilate, right? So it dilates to bring more blood to this tissue that needs more oxygen. But here we're seeing the exact opposite. Here we're seeing that the alveolus has a high oxygen content, and that's when the blood vessels are dilating. And when the alveolus has low oxygen, then those blood vessels constrict. So there is a huge difference between that pulmonary system and the systemic system. Next, we're going to talk about the alveolar ventilation. So alveolar ventilation is really talking about the bronchioles, like are the bronchioles dilated or constricted? So this doesn't have anything to do with the diameter of the blood vessels. This is talking about the diameter of the bronchioles. So let's say that the blood has a high carbon dioxide content in it. Lots of carbon dioxide that is coming back to the lungs. We need to get rid of that carbon dioxide. In this case, the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolus, and the bronchioles in this case are going to be dilated because we need to be able to get rid of all of that carbon dioxide. So the alveolar ventilation will increase whenever you have blood with higher carbon dioxide. In the exact opposite example, if the blood has low carbon dioxide, now that's important too. We need to keep that carbon dioxide in the blood. We want that to stay in the blood. So in that case, the bronchioles will constrict and they'll get a lot smaller because we don't want carbon dioxide to move into the blood and out of the body. We want to keep it in the blood. Then lastly, we want to talk about the respiratory centers in the brain. So this would be our central control of respiration. So with central control, we're talking obviously about the brain, and there are a couple different areas. We have involuntary centers, and then we have voluntary centers. So let's talk about the involuntary centers first. The involuntary centers are going to set the frequency and depth of breathing. Right? So typically a person, an adult, is going to breathe 12 to 18 breaths per minute. That's an adult. The involuntary control centers are found in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata contains this center that's called the Respiratory Rhythmicity Center. And it sets the pace of respiration. So breathe in 2 seconds, breathe out 3 seconds. It's setting that pace. There are two different centers or groups in this respiratory rhythmicity center. The first group is called the dorsal respiratory group, or DRG. And it contains an inspiratory center. So it functions in every single respiratory cycle, quiet or forced breathing. The dorsal respiratory group functions in every cycle, every respiratory cycle. Doesn't matter if it's quiet breathing or if it's forced breathing, it just functions in every single respiratory cycle. It contains an inspiratory center. So it's responsible for the contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostals. And these are the muscles that are used. They contract and then you inhale. And then they relax and then you exhale. And then they contract and then you inhale. So this DRG group, it has this inspiratory center that will send out signals to the diaphragm and the external intercostals and tell them when to contract so that you're going to breathe in. Then we have another center in the respiratory rhythmicity center of the medulla oblongata. And this one is called the VRG, or the ventral respiratory group. So this one controls, it doesn't function in every single cycle. It's only going to function in forced breathing. So when this one gets stimulated, it's going to send nervous signals or nerve signals to the accessory muscles. Of both the expiration and inspiration. So if you remember what those were, for inhalation, you were looking at like the neck muscles. So you're looking at the scalenes and the SCM. And then for the exhalation, we were looking at the abdominal muscles. So the VRG will control both of those in forced breathing, forced inhalation, forced exhalation. Now we're going to talk just a little bit about receptors. So there are receptors in your blood vessels and in your ventricles of your brain that can detect the levels of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH. So let's look at both these peripheral chemoreceptors and the central chemoreceptors. So first, let's look at peripheral chemoreceptors. First of all, peripheral chemoreceptors just means that it's outside of the brain. And the peripheral chemoreceptors are going to detect the levels of pH or oxygen or carbon dioxide. So it's looking to see, is the pH decreased? They detect if the pH is decreased. That means it's acidic. So that's not good. So it'll detect in the blood if the blood is getting acidic. These chemoreceptors will also detect a decrease in oxygen because that's not good. The tissues need oxygen. Or it'll detect an increase in carbon dioxide. So none of those things are great. An increase in carbon dioxide, that means that it's more acidic. And so we don't want the blood to be too acidic, and we want to make sure that there's enough oxygen for the tissues. So that's what the peripheral chemoreceptors are doing. They're detecting these things in blood, right? So there's two different areas where these chemoreceptors are found. They're found in an area called the aortic bodies, and the aortic bodies are in the aorta, just like the name sounds. So they're in the aorta. And they can sense these chemicals. We also find them in the carotid bodies. So the carotid bodies are located in the carotid artery. Okay. And so they're also going to detect changes in those chemicals. So those are the peripheral chemoreceptors. They're detecting these things in blood, and they're found in the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies. Next, we have the central chemoreceptors. So the central chemoreceptors are not going to be located in blood vessels. Instead, they're going to be located in the ventricles. And the central chemoreceptors detect carbon dioxide and pH. And they detect those gases in the cerebrospinal fluid because that's what's flowing through those ventricles. So it's not detecting the blood, it's detecting the CO2 levels and the pH of cerebrospinal fluid. So these central chemoreceptors are trying to detect the levels of carbon dioxide in the cerebrospinal fluid. So if the carbon dioxide levels go up, right, and so they're higher, then you have this urge to breathe out. And if the carbon dioxide levels in your blood are lower, then you don't have the urge to breathe out. So the only time you're really going to breathe out is when your carbon dioxide levels get high, and then you're going to breathe out. So you can actually, a person can drive down their carbon dioxide levels. So you can huff out air like you're hyperventilating to really decrease that CO2 to a point where you could hold your breath until you pass out, because the carbon dioxide levels are so low in your blood that you don't really have that urge to breathe, and you will become unconscious before you even have that urge to breathe again. So on that note, I want to finish up this lecture by talking about two different terms and two different conditions. One condition is called hypercapnia. So hypercapnia, hyper means more, and capnia means carbon dioxide. So in this case, the blood has more carbon dioxide than it really needs. And so this is going to occur when you are not breathing as much. So you're not breathing out as fast as you should, and the carbon dioxide then isn't leaving your body. Instead, it's getting trapped in your lungs and then trapped down in the blood because diffusion won't occur. And so this can be caused by what we call hypoventilation. So hypoventilation means low ventilation or low breathing. So hypoventilation can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused from brain damage. So if a person was involved in an accident and they have brain damage to their respiratory centers, then they're not going to be breathing as fast as they should. It also occurs with some drugs, for instance, the opioids or benzodiazepines. They cause a person to have lower ventilation rates, hypoventilation rates. And so this builds up carbon dioxide then in the blood. You're not breathing it out, so it has to stay in the body. So you end up with more carbon dioxide in the body. This is a problem because now this is going to lead to some type of acidosis in the body because you're not able to get rid of that carbon dioxide. The other condition is called hypocapnia. And so hypocapnia means low carbon dioxide, whereas hypercapnia meant high carbon dioxide. So with low carbon dioxide, and this means in the blood, so EA, it's usually EMEA, but EA also means in the blood. So you've got low carbon dioxide in the blood. Well, why is the carbon dioxide low? Possibly because you've been breathing out too fast. So you're huffing and puffing and breathing that out too fast. So that we call hyperventilation. So the cause of the hypocapnia could be hyperventilation. You're hyperventilating, breathing out too much carbon dioxide. The rate and the depth of respiration is too fast, and the carbon dioxide is leaving the body faster than it's being produced in the body. And so in this case, hyperventilation can be caused by a couple of things. We know that it can be caused by anxiety. It also, though, can be caused by like a mechanical respirator. So if a patient is on a mechanical respirator that's breathing for them, it might be forcing the carbon dioxide out faster than what they really need. So hypocapnia can be caused by hyperventilation. Okay, so that's all we have for the respiratory system. So we'll see you next time.